Okay, we'll get started here. Sorry, we're right up against the last session. All right, so this is Tools for the Modern Web Developer. I'm Josh Peterson. This is Gavin Recumper. We both work in Esri Professional Services. So we'll just dive right in. We've got a short period here. So we're going to talk about a couple tools in depth and go over some demos, the way we use them. And then we're going to talk at the end about a few things that are exciting us for 2018 and stuff that we're looking forward to this year. So I'm going to jump right into DevTools. I wanted to make the point first that all of the evergreen browsers are really embracing DevTools, even Edge. They've hired the guy who wrote Webpack, and he's like leading their DevTools team now. So I'm personally still a Chrome guy, but Firefox and Edge are also catching up and doing really cool things in the DevTools space. Last year, or for the last 5 years, I guess, we've kind of given a lot of high-level kind of overviews of our favorite tools, and I've talked about DevTools a number of times from the sort of 60,000 feet level. But this year I wanted to dive right into one aspect of it, so the sources panel. Both Gavin and I were talking, we've had a lot of experience where we'll talk to other developers about their use of DevTools, and they'll talk about how great Chrome is, and you come to find out it's really just like console.log, right? And they use the console all the time, but diving into the other panels is something that a lot of people aren't super familiar with. So we'll start with the sources panel here. It's made up of three pieces, right? There's the file navigator on the left, the code editor in the middle, and then the debugging pane on the right. Anyone who's coming from a desktop environment with Eclipse or Visual Studio, this looks a lot like the regular IDE, right? So a lot of people will ask sort of, why would you use something like Atom or Visual Studio Code that doesn't have all this rich IDE stuff? I see the DevTools as the IDE, really, right? You write your code in your code editors, but this is where you get the really powerful debugging capabilities. So it's Demo Theater. I'm just going to jump into a quick demo here. So I've got an app here that I put together. Let's refresh it. This resolution is messing with me here. We've got the mobile emulator turned on here just so we can see everything at once, right? So here we're on the sources panel. Command-Shift-I or Control-Shift-I will take you there. Oh, you lost me. All right, let me know if it goes down again, please. So I just wanted to kind of show the left panel over here is that file navigator, right? So we can just kind of see all of the files that are in our application. A couple other useful tabs here, definitely worth checking out. So to open our JavaScript file, we could just click it here, and pardon the screen resolution up there, and kind of see that file in here. But it's a really robust application here, right? So I also can just hit Command-P or Control-P and bring up the command palette, start typing in different things, including just kind of file navigation. So I'm just going to type the name of my file, which on a lot of projects we work on, we have hundreds or thousands of files, right? So it's not always most useful to just kind of navigate the tree on the left-hand side over there. So I'm going to go ahead and open up my JavaScript file, and I'm going to go ahead and hide that Navigator window so we have some more space here. So I've got this app here that just has two buttons. It's using the JavaScript API. It just zooms us to two different locations. But neither of our buttons are working right now. So I wanted to use some of the DevTools in the debugging options here to fix that. So in our index.html, which I can pop open really quickly, we just got two buttons here. Those are the two buttons. And then in our JavaScript, we've got two event listeners, right? So here's an on. We're using Dojo on. For the go to Palm Springs, and then down below we've got another one for our go to take me to Colorado button. And this isn't working. So if I click on the button here, I can see that nothing's happening. I can hit escape to pop open my console, and I can see that nothing's being logged to the console, so there's no like uncaught exceptions happening in the browser, right? So what I want to use first is an event listener breakpoint. A lot of people don't know these exist, but if I go down to mouse, I'm going to expand that and add a click event listener. What that's going to do is now break me on any handled click events that I've got in my code. So I'm going to go ahead and click the button again, and I'm clicking it, and I can still see that it's not happening, right? My function is not being fired. So what that tells me immediately is that there's something wrong with my event listener. It's probably not the actual logic in my function, my callback function. So knowing that, I can look here and see that I just used the wrong element ID. I said zoom to Palm Springs when it's actually go to Palm Springs. I'm going to go ahead and make that change. I'm going to save it right in the browser there. Click the button again. So sometimes we have to refresh the page, right? Because if you think about it, this event handler is being attached when our page loads, not just kind of dynamically. So in this case, I do actually need to refresh my app. Now that I've made that change, I'm going to click the button now, and it's going to break on that breakpoint, right? I didn't have to put a breakpoint. I didn't have to click line 63 or anything like that. It's just going to break on any click event that I'm handling. So now I know that that's happening. I'm going to go ahead and just resume execution, hit the run button, and we can see that it's going to zoom us as well, right? So that helped me to understand that it's not necessarily my logic and my callback. It was actually that I didn't attach the event listener properly in that case. So I'm going to go ahead and come down to our next one since we fixed that first button. And I've got my mouse click event handler still wired up. So I'm going to click this button and see that there's nothing wrong with my event handler. It's working just fine. So I'm going to go ahead and turn that off. I'll hide that there. And run here, but it's still not working. But there are no unhandled exceptions happening either. So I'm not getting a big red error message in my console like we might see a lot, right? So instead of that, I'm going to go ahead and use this super useful pause on exceptions button. And I've already checked it, but I'm going to check on the pause on caught exceptions. This is extremely useful when you're working with a library or an API from a third party, the JavaScript API in this case, right? Because it's going to allow us to find where an exception is happening outside of our own code. So now I'm going to click on that button, and we finally found the error, right? So we've got a cannot read property 0 of undefined. That doesn't mean anything to me as someone who's not familiar with this code base. I could pretty print it, right? Clicking the little brackets icon. It's still pretty hard to understand because it's obfuscated code and whatnot. So the next step for me is I'm going to go to my call stack over here in the debugging panel. And what I typically do is just kind of trace down here and find the first line of code that looks familiar to me, right? The first thing, I could probably click into these other ones and see if I could maybe inspect some of the variables and understand things. But in this case, I'm just going to go down to the bottom of the stack here, and I'm going to see that my goto.js line 116 is kind of the last line of my code that executes that leads up to this exception. And so that tells me that I probably have an error in my invocation of this function or the arguments I'm passing or something like that. I can just hover these guys and check out their properties. I could type them in the console down here because since I'm broken on this line, since I have a breakpoint on this line, everything's in scope, right? So I'm going to check out view, looks good. I'm going to check out view.goto. It's also a function, so I'm not worried, like I'm not out of scope, nothing's undefined. Everything looks pretty solid for me. So my next step would probably be to go look at the JavaScript API documentation and make sure that this object that I'm passing as the argument is proper, right? And I would figure out pretty quickly that I just made a stupid typo and I'm passing a t instead of a y as the coordinate. So I'm going to change that. I'm going to save that change really quickly. I'm going to go ahead and turn off my pause on caught exceptions and resume execution. Let me get out of this Dojo file here. In this case, this code is being executed on click, not like when the page loads. So I don't actually need to refresh my browser this time. I'm just going to click the button, and now it's going to actually work for me, right? So again, I've kind of used a combination of both the pause on caught exceptions tool and the call stack to figure out where in the application the error is originating and ending and kind of tracing it from there. The last thing I wanted to show really quickly was the watch function, which is really popular in like Visual Studio or Eclipse if you're running desktop code, but kind of gets forgotten in the web a little bit. But what I want to do here, you can see I've already added a couple of watch statements. Those are just variables. And I've got a listener here watching the change of the center point of my map. So whenever I move the map, the center point of the map changes, then this function will fire. And so I just kind of pan the map really quickly here. And you can see that my watches are always going to evaluate no matter where my breakpoint is. So I could also have just kind of logged it in the console. I could hover over them here and see them. But if you have values, if you're iterating especially, right? If you're iterating over something and you just want quick reference of the value of some variable, this is a really helpful way to just have that sort of on your view, and you don't need to worry about using your mouse or your keyboard even to evaluate those variables. So that's it, the sources panel. There are other things here as well, right? You can break on XHR fetch requests. You can break on DOM breakpoints. So like when an element gets modified, the size or the location or something like that, you can break on that line of code. There's a ton of stuff. Definitely check out the documentation for DevTools. There's a whole video and a lot of information about all of this stuff. So definitely check that out.
Okay. So another tool that we as web developers use, especially in the GIS world, is Postman, and it's something that Josh and I both use, and we found that sometimes people on our teams don't utilize it, and we think it's a really good tool. Postman has been around for a few years, but over the past few years, Google has actually deprecated. It used to be a Chrome app, but Google is deprecating Chrome apps, so now you have to download the Postman native app for Windows, Mac, etc. But it's basically still the same app, so it's all good. One of the main ways I use Postman is to help me while developing against the ArcGIS REST APIs. So let's take a look at what that might look like. So how many of you have used Postman before? Okay, about half of us, a little bit more. So this is the basic interface. For those of you who haven't seen it, it's a way to send REST requests. On the left-hand side, there's both a history and a stored collections of past requests that you've sent, and on the right-hand side is kind of where you author your requests. So the most basic usage would be you can use, say, we'll do a get, and we can send it to some URL, maybe esri.com. And I'll go ahead and send that off, and we'll see that the web server is returning back the HTML for that get. Of course, you can do all the other different types of HTTP requests, post, put, etc. And there's all the options for params, headers, things like that. But the nice thing about Postman is you can save these requests. So if I go ahead and hit save, maybe I might name this request Esri get. And you can create a collection, which is kind of just a folder. So maybe this is my esri.com requests. And when I save that, even if I go and close Postman or do some other stuff, when I come back to this collection, I can re-pull up that same request with all of the parameters, which really saves me time when doing testing and when doing development. But I want to work with the ArcGIS REST APIs. And to do that, we'd have to switch between the developer's documentation a lot and actually build all of those requests using the params and body and stuff, which I don't have time for that right now. So luckily, Raul over in Esri Spain has a GitHub project out here, and I'll post the URL to this later. But basically, it's just a bunch of JSON collections that you can download and import into Postman. So I'll go ahead and do that. I've already downloaded the zip and extracted the zip. So I'm going to choose the folder that it extracted to. And like magic, you can see these two collections have been created on the left-hand side of my screen. Almost 60 requests are all automatically stubbed out there, so I don't have to create those all myself. Everything from geocoding to routing, geo-enrichment, even ArcGIS open data endpoints to get groups, to get items. It's really great. It's a really great resource to get you going quickly. So I can jump into one of these requests. Let's say maybe I want to do a route, right, against the ArcGIS REST API. And for those of you who are familiar with the API, you always need to use a token. And that token is usually short-lived when you're doing development. One of the nice things that Raul has built into these tools is that all you have to do is utilize the environments functionality of Postman. So you can see this drop down here. I have a couple environments. I've got my ArcGIS Online environment selected. And all I did was go over to developers.arcgis.com, pulled in my client ID and my client secret. Don't steal mine, by the way. And those are not short-lived. And there's a script, a pre-request script that will automatically go out to arcgis.com and create the short-lived token for you. So you don't have to be doing that all yourself, which is super nice. So you can see when I hover this, it says unresolved variable. But as soon as I send off this request, it's going to automatically get a token for me. And now that exists right here. And the request came through. We can see down here we've got some JSON, which is really great. So now I've done this request, and maybe I want to take this request and put it into my application, right? Whether you're doing, Postman makes this really simple. All I have to do is click this code button here, and I can export that request into code in no matter what language I'm using, right? Maybe you're using C#, maybe you're using Node.js, maybe you're using PHP. You just click that, and it gives you literally the programming commands to copy and paste this into your code to do that request, which is super nice. It saves us a lot of time. Additionally, in addition to that, you can create tests. So let's say you wouldn't be testing our APIs, but say you're actually developing an API, you can create unit tests against REST APIs. So just for simplicity, I'll go ahead and make a test against this this request we have here. So let me make this a little bigger. So Postman has its own syntax for this PM variable, and you can basically create tests. Here I've named this got features, and I am basically taking the REST response, turning it into JSON, and saying that I expect the length of the features to be above 0, right? I'm expecting to get at least one feature. And that's using the chai style unit testing. So if you're familiar with unit testing in your programming language, so you can also use that here. So when I send this off, we'll see down, in addition to the request that I get back, I can also see my test results, and I can see that one simple test is passing. So if I save this, say maybe you do some more development, you're putting more tests against these requests, and maybe you've got a couple tests, maybe you've got many, right? You want to run them all at one time to see the results. Postman has this thing called the runner. So if I open this runner panel, you can drill down into a particular collection. So let's drill down into that one that we were just doing. You choose your environment. You can choose a couple settings, like how many times you want to run through all the tests, and Postman will run through all the tests that you have for all of the REST requests in that collection. So you can see, in my case, I just have the one to find out, but you can imagine how you'd have tens or even hundreds of tests there. That should really save you time in testing. Now, if you take this concept of test runners, but allow the runs to be scheduled in the cloud, you've got the new concept of Postman Monitors, which is a kind of a cool new functionality that Postman has built in. One unique way to use this is I pulled an example from the Postman website for link checking. So this is kind of an interesting way to use Postman, maybe not standard, but they're actually using Postman almost as running of your code. And so we can see we have a couple requests here. One request, we're setting up some variables, and in this other request, we've got actually a significant amount of code here in what would usually just be a list of tests. But in this code, we're actually using Cheerio.js, which is basically kind of server-side jQuery, to go through a URL, so a page out on the web. We're getting all the links, and then in this code, it's going to loop through all those links and check if those are valid links. So it's kind of an interesting way to use Postman. So if I switch over to the runner again, and I choose this link checker, and I choose my environment, go ahead and run that. You can see that Postman's going out to, in this case, my website, gavinar.com, pulling all the links, and now it's going through every link to check to see if it works, which is kind of interesting. And then you can also take these tests and send them out to Postman Monitor, like I talked about. So this is Postman Monitor website. And you can actually schedule those out to say, I want to run my link checker every week or every day, and send me the results. And it'll run out on the cloud and send you the results. And yeah, this is just, I think it's a cool feature, and it's a feature that we'll be using kind of in the future. And so speaking of the future, there are a couple of ideas that both Josh and I think we'll be using more and more over the next year. So now we're going to kind of talk about those.
How many people here are writing their own APIs with Node? Anybody? Sort of the back end? Okay. That's where Postman really shines, being able to check your own API endpoints, but using it on the front end is really useful as well. I think we both use it almost on a daily basis. All right, so we're towards the end here, but we wanted to talk about a few of the tools that maybe we've started to use or that we are coming out now, sort of gaining steam, and we're excited about them this year. So has anybody tried to use Chrome DevTools as workspaces before? It's this idea, right, where you can like map your dev tools to your local environment. You notice when I was doing that demo earlier, I can show you here. I've got the little green dot here next to it, and I was able to actually just Command S and save the changes I made here. Those were actually being saved back to my local disk. So Workspaces 2.0 came out just in December. I think it was Chrome 64. And it's kind of like a whole rewrite of that. Workspaces were notoriously buggy before. I know I tried many, many times to get it to work because this is like the holy grail of just like editing my code right there. And it seems to be working really, really well. So I'm really excited to see the iteration and further development on that this year. Lighthouse is another project by Google. It is its own sort of open source standalone project that you can use like through the command line, but it's also embedded within Chrome DevTools. They talk about it as a way to build better websites, and what that means is this idea of progressive web applications, PWAs, right? That are useful offline and on mobile and are kind of more accessible applications, and that includes things like performance and accessibility. If I pop back over here, that manifests itself in the audits tab of Chrome DevTools. So I ran an audit against this application, which didn't turn out so well because I just built it for this demo, but you can see it's giving me some ratings and giving me some instruction on how to make this a better progressive web app, how to make it more performant, more accessible, and how to follow better modern sort of best practices of web development. So Lighthouse is a really cool, exciting thing. Yeah, so, Gavin's going to talk about that.
So who's using Atom or VS Code? Okay, yeah, those are kind of the two most favorite text editors right now in 2018. Both of these text editors have a new functionality that's kind of shared workspaces. VS Code calls it Live Share. Atom calls it Teletype. It allows 2 or more people to work on the same code file at the same time, and you don't have to be in the same location, which is really cool. It's really great for both pair programming if your company does that, or Josh and I have found that it's actually good for mentoring. So if you're working with a developer, might be in the same office or might be across the country or even in a different country, you can actually work on the same code base, learn from each other about the code that you're working on. So that's a feature we're really looking forward to in the coming year. So that's actually all the time we had for today. So thanks everybody for listening. Please, please, please rate us in the app if you like topics like this next year. Go there and let us know that this was good. And then at the very end, we've got all the links that we used are right there. So we'll leave that up there. Thanks again for listening, and we'll be up here to answer some questions.
Are there any questions first before we leave? Yep, go ahead. Yep.
I'm finding problems with breakpoints.
Okay.
It doesn't always stop at my breakpoint. And I find I have to put breakpoints on a couple of consecutive lines, and then it works.
Is that
what's going on there?
So the question is sometimes breakpoints don't stick, kind of, or they don't get hit. Is that usually with asynchronous code, like inside of a promise? So Chrome's doing a lot of work right now. Actually, in like Chrome 55, which just came out in January, I think, they've beefed up their handling of like asynchronous, being able to dive into a promise handler or async await even, and step through code that way. So it's something they're working on. And sometimes you just kind of have to figure out which line to put your breakpoint on, right? Maybe it's the second or third line inside your handler. Yeah. 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 Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, you mentioned Postman. You set out and had the link checking. It was really good for using endpoints in Node.js.
Yep.
Why do you gravitate towards Postman instead of something like RESTlet, or like I use Fiddler because I find the information is much more thorough and
Yeah.
Are those the features specifically that really make you gravitate towards Postman?
I mean, I've just used Postman for the past few years, but yeah, I think Postman's really pushing the envelope in that world. So I think there's some great tools out there. Really, kind of the idea is just to put a great UI on what used to be just curl calls, right? So yeah, some great other tools as well. What were the ones you mentioned? RESTlet.
Yeah.
RESTlet might be a good one. Okay.
Fiddler is excellent for like if you have a desktop application or something like that. Fiddler is still, I think, the go-to. Postman they have some capabilities for handling like non-browser originated requests, but I would say Fiddler is still the way to go there. Yeah.
Yep. Cool. Thanks.
Cool. Yeah. Go for it. What's that? Sorry.
Does that affect being able to save the files from the source?
So as long as your Webpack is configured to support source maps, are you familiar with source maps? Yeah, so source maps is a technology that allows you to take obfuscated code and reference back to the source code, and DevTools understands that reference back. And so you actually can end up setting breakpoints and debugging your source code rather than the built sort of obfuscated code. Yeah. Sorry. That's a good question. Does that work with workspaces? I don't know the answer to that question. Yeah, that is. But can you actually, via the workspaces, can you edit the source code even though it's already been compiled? I would guess not. Right? You might need to tweak your build process a little bit to make sure you're editing the source. Yeah.
What tool does you recommend for memory leak profiling tracing?
Yeah, we can look at that if you want. Yeah, let's look at it first. Thanks, everyone. If you have more questions, feel free to come up. There's not another session for a half hour, so we have some time.